Dear friends in Brazil, USA, and India, we wish to welcome all of you and our distinguished speakers to this landmark lecture organized by Pune International Center Policy Research Think Tank and the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI. The lecture towards the new architecture for international financial institutions will be delivered by Professor Ajay Chhibber, the distinguished visiting scholar at the Institute for International Economic Policy at George Washington University, Washington, D.C. Chairing today's event is Mr. Joshua Felman, principal at the economic consulting firm GH Consulting, which is focused on understanding the Asian markets. We are also honored to have with us Professor Rogerio Studart, Senior Fellow at CEBRI. Professor Studart has participated in different debates on macroeconomics, sustainable development, Brazil-China relations, and international finance. Our other distinguished guests today are Mr. Jose Pio Borges, President of CEBRI, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, Vice President, Pune International Center, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, Trustee at Pune International Center, and the former Indian Ambassador to China, Bhutan, and Pakistan, and Dr. Feliciano de Sa Guimaraes, Academic Director at CEBRI and Professor of International Relations at the University of Sao Paulo. Before I hand over the floor to Ambassador Bambawale, I must mention that it was Dr. Kelkar's suggestion that this lecture by Professor Chhibber should be organized internationally in association with our partner think tank CEBRI. This is the first of our collaborations, and I'm sure many more will follow. May I now request Ambassador Bambawale to please take the floor.
Thank you, Abhay. Let me, on behalf of the Pune International Center and from here in Pune in the Western Seaboard of India, extend a very warm welcome to this very special event to our friends in Brazil, and also to our speakers, both of whom are in Washington, D.C. This is a very special event for two reasons. The first, of course, is that the topic we are discussing today of a new international financial architecture of the Bretton Woods system is a very important subject, especially for people in the developing world, in the emerging markets like India and Brazil. The second reason why today's function is very important is because this is our first joint event with our new partners, CEBRI, the Brazilian Center for International Relations. I want to thank not just our friends in CEBRI for doing this event today. I want to thank all our participants from the Pune International Center. And of course, I want to thank both our chairman, Mr. Joshua Felman, and our main speaker, Dr. Ajay Chhibber, who are joining us from Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bambawale. May I now request CEBRI's Academic Director, Dr. Feliciano de Sa Guimaraes, to say a few words on the significance of this collaboration with PIC. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Abe. Thank you very much. Good morning for those in Brazil. Good evening for those in India. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Feliciano Guimaraes, and I'm the Academic Director at CEBRI and Professor of International Relations at the University of Sao Paulo. I'm here in replacing our Director, Jose Pio Borges, who couldn't be here with us today, unfortunately. And I extend in the name of CEBRI a very warm welcome to everyone. And I'm very glad that we now have this new partnership with Pune International Center. A couple months ago, CEBRI has signed this partnership with PIC, one of the largest and most prestigious think tanks in India. We are now developing some initiative within this partnership, such as in the agenda to analyze India's presidency in the G20, as just mentioned, in 2023, and the participation of CEBRI experts in the Asia the Economic Dialogue, which is co-organized by the Center alongside with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of India. And now within this framework, CEBRI has the opportunity to co-host with PIC this event entitled Towards a New Architecture for International Financial Institutions, with such prestigious participants such as Professor Ajay Chhibber, Ambassador Bambawale, Dr. Vijay, and Mr. Joshua Felman. And comments made by our senior fellow, Professor Rogerio Studart. Mr. Studart was Brazil's former executive director at the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank. CEBRI has created a new center. CEBRI is composed of 13 centers, and Mr. Rogerio Studart is one of our the senior fellow of our newest center, which is Economic Policy Center. And we are very happy for this new partnership. As mentioned by Ambassador previously, Brazil is going to have the presence of the G20 in 2024. Actually, is going to be December 2023. We are also very close to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil to help the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to organize the G20 conference here in Brazil. And we're going to go to India a couple of times this year to see how things are done in India, to see how the G10 is being organized there. We're going to learn a lot. And the subject today, it's very dear to me. My PhD at University of São Paulo at Yale University was about how the bureaucracy of the World Bank and the IMF push or not push for the reform within the quota system of in those two institutions, right? So I've been studying these two institutions for quite some time, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Thank you very much. I'm sure this partnership will be very fruitful, and we're going to have a lot of work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. May I request the chair for today's session, Mr. Joshua Felman, to please take the floor with his opening remarks.
Thank you. Today you're in for a treat. Today's main speaker, Dr. Ajay Chhibber, is one of those people who seems to be everywhere at once. As you heard, he's a distinguished visiting scholar at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. in the United States. He also works in India. He's a senior visiting professor at ICRIAR in New Delhi. He's a member of CII's Economic Advisory Council, and he serves on the External Advisory Group for India's presidency of the G20. These are just a few of the things that Dr. Chhibber has been doing. Amongst all these activities, somehow, he's also managed to find time to write a book with Salman Saud's Unshackling India, Hard Truths and Clear Choices for Economic Revival, which was named Best New Book in Economics for 2022 by the Financial Times in the UK. And this is not his only book. In fact, he's written less than 6 books on economic development. And now, Professor Chhibber.
Thank you. So very grateful to be here, to be with CEBRI. The G20 connection, because we took the baton from Indonesia and we will pass the baton to Brazil. So this particular confluence of timing of this event and this partnership that comes between Pune International Center and CEBRI is a great one. And timed so well, and I hope it will also lead to many more fruitful discussions and solutions. Which is a project started at the Atlantic Council called Bretton Woods 2.0. So this was one of the papers that came out of that project, and we started to focus on that. And it's interesting that after she made that speech, the Indonesians took it up, and certainly the Indian side is very much behind this in the G20. And they look upon it also as a vehicle, this reform of the Bretton Woods institutions as a vehicle for, in a way, opening up the ability of a large part of the developing world to access capital that is sitting in a way idle in large parts of the rich world. But coming back to the presentation next, many of the problems that we saw that led to the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions in 1944, so the plan to set up the Bretton Woods institution was underway during the Second World War itself. It started, according to Secretary Yellen, it started sometime in 1941, before even the United States had entered the war. So you can imagine that at a time like that, how much thinking had gone on to establish these institutions. And the problems that they were set up for, inequality, rising protectionism, nationalism that led to the World War, were what they were designed to address. And to a large extent, I would say, at least in the first 50 years, there's been a lot of criticism of many of their policies, which I'll come to. But my broad assessment in this paper is that these institutions pretty much helped towards addressing some of those problems that were identified when they were established. But in this century, and particularly since the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9, we have seen that that progress has halted. And as Josh also mentioned, new problems, even bigger problems, have surfaced, particularly climate change. And now, as we see with this pandemic, also other threats, global threats that have emerged. So the Bretton Woods institutions, and we have also seen very sharp increases in inequality. We have also the world going back to protectionism and nationalism in a big way, and even war. I mean, we have already the beginnings of the slide to war that we see in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So all those problems have resurfaced, and then some more have been added. Next slide. So we argue that today's Bretton Woods institutions are too small to deal with today's global problems. The size of the IMF is smaller than the size of sovereign wealth funds and the swap arrangements that dwarf what the fund has to offer. Fund's total size now is less than 1% of global GDP. It's too small, as we saw, to even deal with 2 or 3 major crises in 2 or 3 countries, let alone a global crisis. And the World Bank is in a similar position. Its resources are too small, and it has not been able to mobilize private capital to the extent that it was supposed to. Next slide. Now, coming to each one individually, I think the biggest failure that our paper identifies for the IMF is its inability to predict or deal with global crisis. And part of this also comes from the way its mandate morphed over the period after the after the Second World War. Initially, of course, it was meant to monitor exchange rates, but once the US got off the gold peg, then those arrangements fell apart. The IMF reinvented itself to deal with largely with developing country issues, emerging market and developing country issues. It has had very weak surveillance in advanced economies, partly because none of those countries wanted to have the IMF surveillance, but partly also, as I found when writing this paper, sufficient evidence that there was also self-censorship by the IMF when it went into surveillance in advanced economies. As a result, it was unable to see very clearly what was happening globally, and therefore has been totally unable to predict global size. I list also here many other criticisms of the IMF, valid criticisms to a large extent: premature capital market liberalization, which has probably led to more instability, excessive austerity and pro-cyclical programs. This emerged very starkly during the Asian financial crisis. Arbitrary program size. I mean, the Greek program was 32 times quota, et cetera, et cetera. And many countries have been in IMF programs for a very, very long period of time. For more than half of their membership, they have been under IMF programs. So there's been this sort of restructuring of IMF programs and continuous sort of. And now, of course, this whole issue of getting into issues that might be probably more relevant and more the domain of other institutions, such as gender and climate change. There's no problem when climate change is looked at from a macro perspective as to how it will affect growth and macro stability. But to have the IMF now lending for climate change, 20-year lending for climate change makes it begin to look like more like an aid agency. And the former IMF chief economist, Ken Rogoff, has already said pretty much to that. The World Bank also did well. It had shifted focus from its initial mandate to focus on global poverty and made, I would say, considerable effort and help and progress in that. But lately, its biggest failure is that, in the words of former Vice President Al Gore, that it's missing in action on climate change. And that, I think, is it should be its biggest mandate. And it is a really, it appears to be a very reluctant sort of, provider of assistance on that subject. Despite what the president of the World Bank says, that, they have $30 billion worth of lending for climate change, and they are focusing on it. The reality is that the world needs a very different institution than what the World Bank is today. In fact, it has become a laggard, not a leader in development thinking. Its biggest failure, of course, lies in the fact that it is just too focused on one instrument, loans, and not using many of its other instruments that it already has, such as guarantees and support for insurance products, which would help it to catalyze much greater amounts of resources than to the developing world, which are badly needed. India, for example, does not need $1 to $2 billion or even $3 billion of lending, which is small potatoes for a country like India, especially when net flows are probably negative to these institutions. It needs trillions. Now, there was a paper produced by the World Bank and the multilateral, and this, by the way, this kind of criticism also applies not just to the World Bank, but also to many of the regional banks, the Asian Bank, the Inter-American Bank, etc. They're pretty much similar. They have also been far too conservative in the use of their capital, as we point out in the paper. The equity to loan ratios of these institutions are actually far more conservative than any commercial bank out there. And they have not given enough attention to the possible use, and this is somewhat controversial, but I would say possible use of a small fraction of their callable capital. So they have paid-in capital and they have callable capital. They're pretty much focused on using the paid-in capital as their capital base, but a very small fraction of their callable capital could actually enhance their ability to leverage far more resources for the big challenges that the world faces today, especially on climate change. Next. I included the WTO here because, it was the successor to the GATT, which did emerge not immediately at the time of the Bretton Woods Conference, but soon thereafter. I think the problems of the WTO are well known. We are seeing a big slide towards protectionism. Within the WTO structure, there are lots of issues. There's the issue of some countries like China giving themselves self-status as a developing country, the use of SOEs and hidden subsidies, the way the United States has gone after the appellate body and tribunal, basically made it almost inoperative at this point. And then the whole issue of labor and environmental standards that will come to the attention, especially with this carbon border adjustment mechanism that is being discussed so seriously going forward. So I think there's a whole set of issues. We can talk more about it. Next. So as Josh said, and in order to frame the going forward, I framed it as the 3 R's: rules, and here's a list of areas where rules have basically broken down. And it's not an exhaustive list. I just gave it as an example. It's probably the hardest place to get an agreement on, but I put it out there. Next. The remit, and here I argue that these institutions, especially the World Bank and the IMF, are just too focused on developing countries. They need to be seen as global institutions that set rules globally and enforce those rules globally. And we need a rule-based global system and more predictable financing. And a G20 suitably amended, maybe with a special chair for Africa, etc., to provide broad overall strategic direction to this process going forward. So thank you very much. I could go on talking about this, but I hope to hear more from others. So Gordon Brown said, sometimes it takes a crisis. So, you know, I think the time has come to have this reform. Thank you. I'll stop here, Josh.
Thanks, Ajay. I'm in an astonishing position. We have a speaker who's actually finished ahead of time. It never happened to me, but thank you. So I guess now we should turn straight away to Professor Studart for his comments. Professor Studart is a senior fellow at the Brazilian Center for Engineering. But very importantly, before that, he spent quite some time working with multilateral institutions. He was executive director at the World Bank Group and the Inter-American Development Bank. He was also a macroeconomist at the United Nations. And also he's the author of several books. He's published articles in specialized journals, and he was a professor at the Faculty of Economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. So with that introduction, Professor Studart.
I'm muted. Okay, I do it. Okay. Well, good morning and good evening to all those listening to us. Thank you for the invitation, and I want to salute all the other participants of this very interesting seminar. Thanking Ambassador Bambawale for his introduction, Mr. Joshua Felman for his kind words, and also my colleagues Paulo and Feliciano for being here, and Dr. Chhibber for a very interesting presentation. I'm going to try to be as concise as possible so that we can have more time for discussion. I completely agree with when it comes to what is needed with Dr. Chhibber when it comes to what is needed to reform in the multilateral, Washington-based multilateral institution. I think, though, that we should think about those reforms of the multilateral institutions in a broader perspective of a change in the international financial institutions. That's I think we need to think in a much broader way, not only because the circumstances are completely different from those when the Washington-based institutions were created, but because we have crises that are much more significant than the ones. Well, they're mounting crises that require a completely different type of international financial architecture, I think. Let me just remind you the situation then, and it was good that Dr. Chhibber started with history, because history also allows us to think about the present, the challenges of the past and the challenges of the present, and what is needed. What was then in the 1940s and after the war, the situation when the multilateral, the Washington-based institutions were created. At the time, there was a need, particularly after the war, for a reconstruction of the world economy. That when we say world economies, we're talking about the major players of the world economy. And that require resuming trade in a different way, controls over capital flows, looking for the financial stability of the planet in order not to repeat the mistakes that were made previous to the war, and was many of those in Bretton Woods then, were a major cause of the war itself. So it was the intention was to reconstruct the world economy in order to guarantee peace for the future and prosperity. And inflation, which touched the issue of stability of the world economy, that tightening, particularly of those countries that have used all the fiscal resource, fiscal space in order to address the issues of COVID, the food and energy crisis, and other needs. And then you have the emergency that has always been there, which is the climate emergency. So we have a situation now that we have to tackle with all those crises, that we have an emergency that cannot be postponed, which is the climate one, because this is going to lead to further waves of crisis in the future.